Hello and welcome to Vero Stories. In this video I'll tell you about the cozy horror story of the friendly neighbor. It had been a long, winding road to their new home. A gentle climb up the hills, where the trees lined the roads like tall sentinels and the air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth. Evelyn and her family, her husband, Tom, and their two children, Lucy and Ben, had finally arrived at the house they had dreamed about for years. The house was nestled in the corner of a quiet neighborhood, just off the main road, with ivy crawling up the side of the building and a garden in desperate need of a trim. But it was theirs now, and it felt perfect. The moving truck had pulled away late in the afternoon, leaving the house in silence. Evelyn, grateful to finally be alone, had let out a soft sigh. But it wasn't long before the doorbell rang. It was a small, polite sound, an invitation, not a demand. Evelyn paused, wiping her hands on her apron, and glanced over at Tom, who was inspecting the kitchen's old, creaking cabinets. "Could you get that?" she asked, already turning back to the sink. Tom looked at the door and raised an eyebrow. "A neighbor maybe." "I'll be right back," Evelyn said with a smile, wiping her hands once more. She opened the door to find a woman standing on the porch. She was tall, with short gray hair that framed her face like a halo and soft eyes that gave her a warm, welcoming appearance. She wore a long floral dress, and in her hand, she held a tray with a teapot and 2 cups. "Hello," the woman said cheerfully. "I'm Mrs. Kessler. I live just down the street. I thought I'd come by and introduce myself." Evelyn smiled. "How kind of you. I'm Evelyn, and this is Tom, my husband. And we have 2 children, Lucy and Ben. Well, it's lovely to meet you all." Mrs. Kessler's voice was sweet, her smile genuine. "Would you like to join me for a cup of tea? I always make too much, and I thought perhaps you'd enjoy some. The kids too, of course," she added, with a quick glance toward the door. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, glancing back into the house at the still-packed boxes. But something about Mrs. Kessler's manner was so warm, so inviting, that Evelyn found herself agreeing. "That sounds lovely," she said, stepping back and holding the door wide open. "Please, come in." Ben and Lucy had been playing in the corner of the room with their toys when they saw the stranger enter. They both stopped and stared as this stranger entered their room with an interesting sense, as if she was a long-lost grandmother visiting her grandchildren for the first time. She introduced herself to the children. At the same time Evelyn and Tom had grabbed their jackets and the children's and told them that they were all going to quickly go to Mrs. Kessler's for some tea. The family then followed her across the road. The house was of a similar design to their own but much older, with worn wood and creep vines slowly climbing its way up the side. The family entered the home after Mrs. Kessler. She moved into the house with a grace that belied her years. She placed the tray down on the old oak table in the living room, where the sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. The furniture was mismatched, some pieces old and others new, and the entire house felt like a mixture of history and the promise of a new chapter. As Mrs. Kessler poured the tea with a careful, practiced hand, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the odd little details of the room. The soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The peculiar paintings on the wall, dark, moody landscapes, with a shadowy quality that made them seem alive. And then, there were the dolls. Scattered throughout the room, tucked into corners and sitting primly on chairs, were dozens of dolls. They were exquisitely crafted, with porcelain faces and delicate clothing. Each one had glassy eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light, and their stares were unnervingly lifelike. They were almost too real, their features too detailed, their poses too perfect. Lucy nudged Ben and pointed toward one sitting near the fireplace. It was a little girl, dressed in a faded blue dress, with a bonnet over her head. The girl's porcelain face was painted with the faintest smile, but her eyes seemed to follow them. Ben frowned and looked away quickly, trying to distract himself with his toy car. Mrs. Kessler, noticing the children's gaze, smiled knowingly. "Ah, you've spotted them, haven't you? My collection. Are they yours?" Lucy asked, her voice quiet and uncertain. Mrs. Kessler's eyes twinkled as she nodded. "Yes, dear. Each one of them. I've been collecting for years, you see. I find them fascinating. Each doll has its own story. They're like little pieces of history, frozen in time." The children exchanged uncertain looks, but their curiosity got the better of them. They began to inch closer, trying to get a better look at the dolls. There were so many of them, lined up on shelves, tucked into armchairs, placed in nooks and crannies like they had always been there. Lucy stopped in front of one of them, a doll dressed in a red dress with a lace collar. It was a little girl, with dark, curly hair and a large, sweet smile that made Lucy's chest tighten. There was something unsettling about her, something familiar. "Mom," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. I think this one looks like me." Evelyn turned her head toward her daughter. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Lucy took a cautious step forward, her finger pointing toward the doll's face. "Her hair, it looks like mine," she said, her voice low. "And her eyes. And her smile. She looks like me." Evelyn's gaze flicked from the doll to her daughter, but Mrs. Kessler was already standing up. "You're a sweet girl, dear. You look just like the doll. I've always thought that's what makes them so special, how they seem to reflect the people who observe them." Evelyn forced a smile, uneasy. "I suppose that's true." But then Ben, who had been quietly playing with his toy he had brought with him, looked up with a strange expression on his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open in disbelief. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. "That one," he pointed toward a doll sitting in a chair by the window. It was a little boy, with blonde hair and a blue shirt. "That one looks like me." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She looked from Ben to the doll and back again. The doll's features were eerily similar to her son, right down to the mischievous glint in its painted eyes. It was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Kessler's voice broke through the tension. "Oh, yes. Children are so often like that, aren't they? They see themselves in the things around them. It's part of the magic of childhood, I think. Dolls are a reflection of that magic." But Evelyn's stomach twisted. Something about Mrs. Kessler's words felt off, too careful, too rehearsed. She looked around at the dolls again, her discomfort growing. They all looked so lifelike, so real, in fact, that she almost expected them to blink, to move, to breathe. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. There was something wrong. These dolls were more than just simple toys. They were something darker. Something alive. Tom, sensing her unease, gave her a reassuring smile. "I think we should take a break from the dolls and let the kids have some tea. It's been a long day, after all." Mrs. Kessler smiled and nodded, but there was something in the way her gaze lingered on them that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. "Of course. You're welcome to stay as long as you like," she said. And with that, the conversation turned to other topics, about the neighborhood, about the local schools, about the weather. But Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about those dolls. And the longer they stayed, the more she began to wonder if there was something more to Mrs. Kessler's kindness. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they made their excuses. Mrs. Kessler escorted them to the door, still chatting cheerfully, her demeanor completely unruffled. "Thank you for the tea," Evelyn said, forcing a smile. "It was lovely." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Mrs. Kessler replied, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You'll come again, won't you? I'd love to have you over more often." Evelyn nodded, but something in her stomach twisted as she looked down at her children. Lucy and Ben were unusually quiet, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the dolls in the corners of the room. As they stepped outside, the door closed softly behind them, and the warmth of the house was suddenly gone. The evening air was cold and biting, the shadows long and thick. Lucy shuddered. "Mom, Dad, I don't like it there." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't like the dolls," she said, her voice trembling. "They look too much like us." Evelyn's stomach sank. She hadn't wanted to say it out loud, but now that Lucy had spoken it, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The dolls did look like them. As they reached the front door of their new home, Evelyn turned to look back toward Mrs. Kessler's house. The windows were dark, but she thought she saw a faint movement inside, a shadow that seemed to watch them from behind the curtains. The feeling of being watched didn't leave them all night. And as the family tried to settle into their new home, no one could shake the unsettling thought that, just maybe, the dolls weren't just dolls at all. The next day, Evelyn and Tom decided to both take a walk around the neighborhood, to get an idea of the whole area and to see the park that was only a 100-meter walk away from the house. But when they had made their way back, they had noticed Mrs. Kessler's house, specifically one of the windows. In the window sat two new dolls. One was a little girl with bright red curls, wearing a dress identical to Evelyn's. And the other was a little boy with tousled blonde hair, dressed in a blue shirt just like Tom's. The dolls were staring at them. And they weren't smiling. They were watching. Later that day, while unpacking boxes, the doorbell rang again. But this time, neither of them wanted to answer.